What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a bit different, talking about the availability and sort of legacy, I guess, of games like Neverwinter Nights 2 and other titles that use Dungeons & Dragons 3rd and 3.5 edition. So I'm currently playing through Neverwinter Nights 2 again via the Enhanced Edition that recently released, and so that then kind of had on my mind the fact that one of my favorite things about that game is actually its rendition of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. That is my favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons, with my favorite TTRPG rule set actually being Pathfinder 1e, which takes D&D 3.5 and vastly expands upon it. But over the years, thanks to all of the different kinds of games that I cover, I actually kind of know the answer to a natural question one might ask in response to that, which is, why are there not a lot of D&D 3.5 games as an example? Or, to take that a little farther, why are there basically no Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition games either? And it's an interesting mix of factors. I thought it might just be fun to sit down and talk about those things specifically and why we are where we are in that regard, given that I would say, by and large, these rule sets have been left behind in favor of the infinitely more popular 5th edition, but we'll talk more about that towards the end. Now, to expand a little bit on what I mean here, you may very well notice, if you start going through all of these old games, that there's actually a block of time where there really wasn't a lot of Dungeons & Dragons games being released, period. This is from roughly 2006, 2007 until like 2014, 2015. So about a 10-year period, 8 to 10 years there. There really weren't a lot of D&D games released at this point, with notable exceptions like the Neverwinter MMO, but you compare that to a very popular period there in the late 90s, early 2000s, with a whole host of different CRPGs utilizing the systems, or even to now when we've just recently got things like Baldur's Gate 3 just a couple years ago, and other games on the horizon even. But the reason for that sort of period of D&D drought, if you will, is actually pretty straightforward. Simply put, it was typical corporate nonsense. Basically, Atari had the rights to release the video games at that point, which then wound up in a huge legal battle before Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro eventually fully got the rights to these video game publishing back, which is why the game releases up to that point started picking back up again. And during that 8 to 10 year period, most of what we got were things like the enhanced editions for the Baldur's Gate series, alongside a couple of hack and slash type of titles, which kind of brings me to my second point here. Another reason we don't have a lot of these types of games is because they are incredibly rules heavy. So say what you will about 3.5 or 3rd versus whatever other edition of D&D you want, just a fact of the matter is, even for people who love it like myself, is that it's a very rules heavy edition of D&D. And the back half of the 2000s was really marked by kind of a switch at the time, especially by like console markets and things, into more action-oriented titles, which saw the relative death of the CRPG genre, or at least was a contributing factor of it. And that is where D&D had previously thrived. And frankly, a lot of the more action-oriented D&D titles were struggling hard. Most of them did not do well. Combine that with the fact that the games just weren't being made to begin with, and you've got a rocky situation that basically meant very few games were getting released. And as should probably be obvious by the nature of this video, those are also like the prime years for these editions of D&D. So 3rd edition released in 2000, 3.5 released in 2003, with 4th edition officially releasing in 2008. The thing is, 4th edition was just never super popular. It's by and large been forgotten. And off the top of my head, I think the only game that really used it much at all, and even then a very much modified version of it, was the Neverwinter MMO. That game was originally made with 4th edition in mind, which makes sense. 4th edition is also very rules heavy, and having a computer to, sort of automate all of that is honestly probably the best thing you could have done with it realistically. It's the kind of thing that fits into a video game very well. But because of everything I just mentioned, the Neverwinter MMO was one of the incredibly few games that got released during this period, in, I believe it was 2013. So with that in mind, there was basically a very narrow window in which games that used 3rd and 3.5 edition realistically could have released to begin with, which pretty much explains right away why we got so very few of them. Because by the time all of the stuff with the D&D publishing rights got sorted out, 5th edition, which launched in 2014, was out and everybody loved it. So they definitely weren't going to circle back, or at least in large, as we will again get to in a bit, because at this point, we're now going to talk a little bit about the games that actually used 3rd and 3.5 edition before we start talking about the sort of inspired games, that is to say non-D&D games directly, which use these systems as well. Though do keep in mind, this is not meant to be like a complete list of every game entry that could have possibly used these, or have been inspired by them. Now, in terms of D&D games, pretty short list, to be honest with you. For directly 3.0 edition, you've basically got Pools of Radiance, Ruins of Myth Draenor, Neverwinter Nights 1, Icewind Dale 2. Of those, I think it's safe to say Neverwinter Nights 1 wound up being the most popular because the Myth of Draenor release, which happened in 2001, was pretty much a failure. It is a very much dungeon crawl experience, and there's not really a whole host of like role-playing or anything outside of a few interactions with NPCs. It's basically just a romp through a dungeon, which was popular enough at the time, but even here it's not really what people wanted from the setting. So it's not a particularly popular title even when it released, and, honestly, good luck even getting it to run these days. Neverwinter Nights, on the other hand, is a much different story. That game was very popular, not so much for the game itself, but rather its tool set from the Aurora engine that allowed people to make and maintain their own adventures and tell their own stories via things like the multiplayer option with the persistent worlds people made. And ironically, probably the most enduring legacy of the games that use this system is the persistent worlds from both of the Neverwinter Nights titles, which I think is interesting. And since we're on the subject of Neverwinter Nights, both it and its sequel actually wound up using what I think is probably a really smart method of dealing with this edition, which is actually the package system. So as I mentioned, this rule set is rules heavy, and as a result, it can be a lot to ask someone to learn all of it. The way Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2 get around this problem is by offering packages for each class. Basically, this is a default set of level up options that guide a character down a specific path, with the person playing it only kind of having to know in general what they wanted to do. And given these games real-time with pause nature, that fits the slightly more fast-paced nature of it anyway. So you combine that with the tool set everybody was using to do their own thing, and I think you kind of get the gist of why Neverwinter Nights was so memorable. But there is actually one other game that used D&D 3.0, and that is in fact Icewind Dale 2, which released in 2002. One of the very last games out the door at Black Isle Studios before they wound up closing down. Icewind Dale 2 is actually a really fun game to play if you can get around to it, but it's also notable for being an Infinity Engine game, and the reason that matters is because the games made in the Infinity Engine from Black Isle Studios had mostly been 2nd edition. And as a result, the implementation you get in Icewind Dale 2 of 3rd edition is honestly kind of like a weird amalgamation of those two editions. 2nd and 3rd, so I wouldn't entirely say that just calling it 3.0 is completely accurate, as it is just kind of another game that got caught in a weird place in time. But that brings us to the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 games. So, talking about the D&D games specifically, there's basically only 3 of these as well, and one of them isn't exactly 3.5 either, and that is basically Temple of Elemental Evil, Dungeons & Dragons Online, and Neverwinter Nights 2. So Dungeons & Dragons Online is technically a game that uses this rule set, but because of the MMO nature of that game, it has also been heavily modified, and by the way, still running. You can play that for free if you wanted to. While Dungeons & Dragons Online is using 3.5, its implementation is a bit different because of its nature. Which brings us to the other two, Temple of Elemental Evil and Neverwinter Nights 2. First, the Temple of Elemental Evil, because it released first. In 2003, this one was dropped. Notable that the Temple of Elemental Evil takes place in the setting of Greyhawk, as opposed to the Forgotten Realms or Faerun, which has become kind of the default which I mention because if you were to actually play this game, you wouldn't, immediately recognize like the names of the deities and stuff, unless you've, of course, played a game in Greyhawk before, I suppose. But the Temple of Elemental Evil is an interesting one because it is actually based or centers around an adventure module going all the way back to 1985 with the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons system, which I mentioned because the original module was, built for a different system of D&D. Now, Temple of Elemental Evil was made by Troika Games, which is currently defunct these days, but you can, in fact, watch Tim Kaine talk all about this game. He has a channel these days and is, one of the chief people who developed it at Troika Games. And Tim Kaine has multiple videos going over the development of this game and just like the things that went into it. And it's a really interesting listen if you have the time. But for the sake of this video, what I want to mention here is basically that the Temple of Elemental Evil is an interesting one in the sense that it's one of those modules that has remained popular over the years because it was kind of one of like the original mega dungeons, complete with an elaborate backstory, multiple factions within the temple fighting each other, just all that stuff. So it's a really good module, honestly, even to these days. And while being basically the only isometric CRPG that utilizes the 3.5 rule set, the game does, unfortunately, have one really big problem, and that is the fact that it really just doesn't run well on modern machines. So it likely won't start for you at all, even if you buy it in the only place it's available, which is the GOG version. And in order to get this game to run, you're likely going to have to install two mods known as Circle of 8 and Temple Plus, and while those will typically get the game running for you, what it won't solve is problems with like save file corruption and the like. So unfortunately, while this game is still available, it is, I would say, on the brink of being lost to just digital advancement, which I think is actually one of the reasons you don't hear people talk about this one too much, because it is fast approaching becoming just unplayable on modern machines, which is a shame because it really is a cool adventure under here. But then that brings us to the last big D&D game I want to talk about, which is none other than Neverwinter Nights 2. So, one of the reasons I was excited about this enhanced edition to begin with, despite it being unfortunately a little underwhelming in terms of what it changed, the game itself of Neverwinter Nights 2 has the distinction of being the most readily available 3.5 video game. Combine that with the fact that it also adds things like races and stuff you don't get to usually play as, like the Yuan-Ti Purebloods, and you've got yourself in a situation where there is a very specific experience that Neverwinter Nights 2 provides that basically no other game can, because no other game has tried to do these exact things. Which probably isn't a surprise given that it was a pretty lackluster release for a variety of reasons, typical things like bugs and whatnot, but also the fact that most people who were going to play this from, say, Neverwinter Nights 1 were pretty attached to the persistent worlds and things and the easier to use toolkit from the original game that they just weren't inclined to make the switch over to the new game. But that isn't to say that Neverwinter Nights 2 doesn't have its own dedicated community. In fact, one of the big things about the Enhanced Edition was getting the people who were still playing on the persistent worlds fully moved over and on to this better and updated client, theoretically. And I think in large part, the people in those communities are really the people keeping 3.5 alive in terms of video games. But we're not done yet before we start talking about additions and everything, because I would be remiss not to mention a few more, and these are the games that kind of use the 3.5 rule set but are adjacent to it. So what might actually surprise people is KOTOR 1 and 2. These both use a modified version of D&D 3.0. So if you've played these games, it might be readily apparent that it uses some sort of Dungeons & Dragons system, but specifically it's an adaptation of 3.0, and I think it's been changed enough to not really be beholden to Dungeons & Dragons on its own, which is probably why people don't necessarily put 2 and 2 together here, but releasing in 2003 and 2004 respectively, these are two really fun games that are still pretty widely available today thanks to mods and things that have kept them alive that provide a decent way to get a taste of what this particular rule set of D&D has to offer without necessarily going all in on the very rules-heavy nature of it, because in many ways I actually think the adaptation from D&D into the Star Wars world here some of the changes they made there to make things like lightsabers and stuff feel a little less unwieldy actually make it probably a lot more approachable for people, which is, I think, one of the reasons those games wound up doing so well, outside of just the Star Wars IP itself, of course. But we're not done yet, because I would be remiss not to mention Knights of the Chalice 1 and 2. So these are the kinds of games people are constantly asking me to play that I admittedly don't have a lot of experience with personally, and that is because I am a very biased individual like anybody else, and I'm almost loath to admit it, but Knights of the Chalice to me reminds me of those TV shows that occasionally need like a snippet of a video game to have on in the background, but they're obviously not going to use a real video game in most cases, so they make a quick mock-up. And every time I look at Knights of the Chalice 2, it reminds me exactly of that, which is not fair to those games at all, I fully admit, but if I'm being honest, it's one of like the main reasons I haven't played them. Nonetheless, one of the most notable features of those games, though, that it relies on pretty heavily is the fact that they utilize Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. Knights of the Chalice 2 released relatively recently, back in 2022, as a matter of fact, but they have hardly received widespread popularity. And then, two of my personal favorites, we have Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous via the Pathfinder systems. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning these is because these both utilize Pathfinder 1e as a rule set, and Pathfinder 1e is really just an expansion of the original D&D 3.5. In fact, many of the original adventure paths for Pathfinder actually used D&D 3.5 before they fully made their own system via Pathfinder 1e. But I think with that rundown, you kind of get the idea of what has happened with video games in terms of these particular rule sets. And what is most interesting about that to me is that despite the relatively limited releases within these rule sets, the games that did release all had a very, very dedicated fan base, even if it was small. And in fact, that fan base was so dedicated that many of those communities are still going right now, all the way in 2025. Because as I just mentioned with Neverwinter Nights 2, there were conversations being had within the Persistent World community about how to, of course, migrate that to the new Enhanced Edition and keep those communities intact, because the Neverwinter Nights community is in fact probably one of the most enduring overall of all of the ones that I've mentioned here. And I think that highlights ultimately kind of what I want to get at with the end of this video. You see, D&D 3.0, 3.5, Pathfinder 1e, all of these really rules-heavy systems have a way of attracting a very dedicated crowd. And while I would not pretend that that crowd has ever been particularly big or all-encompassing, as frankly just the sales numbers of many of these video games would tell you, what they have always been is dedicated. And while I certainly can't speak for all of them, what I can speak for is myself, and for me at least, one of the reasons I'm more attracted to these more rules-heavy systems is that they provide a level of engagement with a character via all the number crunching and things that, in a weird way, kind of allows me to more easily slip into that person's shoes, because I have to wonder about how they operate at basically every little level to a point that's probably too much for your average person, which is, I think, probably the reason that more rules like medium systems like 5th edition D&D are much more popular, because they allow you to get invested in a class and the character fantasy of it without necessarily going all in on the rabbit hole of numbers, but they also provide enough numbers to keep you engaged and actually have to think about what you're doing and how this character would behave on a mechanical level, and not just a roleplay one. But to sort of start wrapping this up, I think the legacy of these games is a really interesting thing, because as much of a sort of flash in the pan period of time that all of this happened in, this particular rule set spawned so many games that people were just incredibly diehard about. The KOTOR series, Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, even Dungeons & Dragons Online has a really dedicated community these days. And maybe it's because I spent a good bit of high school playing D&D 3.5 and Pathfinder 1e with, high school friends, that kind of thing. I've always found myself really kind of fascinated with video games around these systems and how people are attracted to them, and how the people that really enjoy them are even inclined to really keep these communities alive, even via like spin-offs and the like. So as a result, that's just a sort of incredibly interesting period of video game history to me, which is obviously why I made this video. And while I would love to manage to round this out with some moving observation or philosophy, I'll simply just say this. While the systems and the games themselves may change, I think what stays constant is how these things bring people together, which I think we can see most recently with a game like Baldur's Gate 3. A game that has brought who knows how many people together over shared experiences, and while it might certainly be a very different flavor than what I grew up with, the fundamentals of it remain the same, and I think that's an incredible thing. And so, hopefully you enjoyed hearing me talk about all that in this entirely unnecessary and honestly kind of long video. And if you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.